April 1944. The train clattered westward across the American plains, a line of boxcars sealed tight with iron locks, carrying women who had grown up believing they were marching straight into hell. The propaganda had promised starvation, cruelty, cages. They had been warned about beatings, dogs, public humiliation. For most, the word America meant enemy. For some, it meant death. But when the train screeched to a halt in the desert heat and the doors banged open, what spilled out was not fury, not hatred. It was silence. No jeering crowds, no rifles leveled at their heads, just the blazing Arizona sun and rows of wooden barracks waiting like ghost houses on the sand. The first shock was the paperwork. Clipboards, signatures, names carefully recorded in neat handwriting by soldiers who spoke German without hesitation. Geneva Convention, Article 17, the lieutenant explained, his voice flat, his accent flawless. Your identity will be preserved. Your family will be notified. Not one word matched the nightmare rehearsed in their minds. They were marched into the camp, not with whips cracking overhead, but with guards whose rifles stayed slung, bayonets still sheathed. The barracks smelled of pine and fresh sawdust, the kind of scent that belonged in a workshop, not a prison. Each cot carried a thin mattress, a wool blanket, a bar of soap placed squarely on the pillow as if in welcome. Some of the women stared at the soap in disbelief, waiting for the joke to turn cruel. Others touched it and pulled their hands back as if it might burn. By dusk, the desert cooled, and the first meal bell rang. And that was when the real shock began. They filed into a mess hall buzzing with light. The air smelled of butter and roasted meat, so thick it made stomachs twist in disbelief. Behind the counter, an American sergeant ladled food onto tin trays, beef, mashed potatoes, a roll still warm enough to steam when torn open, green beans, canned fruit. It was not gruel. It was not punishment. It was the same meal served to American soldiers just across the fence. The women froze, whispering to one another that it must be poisoned, that it was a trick. They had been warned too many times. But then a lieutenant sat down with them, her tray identical, and ate without hesitation. Geneva Convention, she explained again. Same rations as U.S. troops. Law, not mercy. And in that moment, the floor shifted beneath them. Everything they had been told about America's savagery cracked. Daily life settled into routine, but not the routine of a dungeon. The women worked laundry, kitchens, clerical duty, and earned camp script they could spend at the canteen. Toothpaste in shining metal tubes, paper, pencils, cigarettes, small luxuries they hadn't touched since before the war. They lined up for mail call, for recreation, for the weekly film screenings shown on a battered projector in the camp theater. Guards enforced order, yes, but with rules, not fists. No random beatings, no arbitrary cruelty. The punishments that did exist, extra duty, loss of privileges, isolation cells, felt almost bureaucratic compared to the horror stories they had expected. Many stared at the system with suspicion, waiting for the mask to fall. Surely this comfort was bait. Surely the brutality was still coming. But weeks passed, months passed, the steak kept arriving on plates, the guards kept following regulations, and the women began to ask themselves whether they had been lied to all along. The contrast was unbearable at times. Letters trickled in from home describing bombed-out streets, hunger, cities in ruins. Some women read of parents lost in air raids, of siblings missing in the east. And all the while, they sat under desert skies, full stomachs, clean beds, steady work. Shame mixed with relief, and neither feeling would go away. One German nurse whispered to her bunkmate, "If my mother could see this food, she would think I was a traitor." Yet, at the same time, hunger is stronger than ideology. Every bite of pie, every scoop of ice cream in the canteen was both a betrayal and a revelation. For the Americans, this was strategy as much as compassion. Washington wanted to show the world that democracy honored its word, that even enemies were bound by law, not vengeance. Humane treatment became propaganda in reverse. If German women went home telling stories of steak and cake instead of starvation, then perhaps future wars could be won not only with bombs but with ideas. Inside the camp, the women lived that paradox daily. Guards played baseball on Sundays, and sometimes POWs were invited to watch from the bleachers. Church services were allowed, chaplains reading scripture in German. One barrack even set up an orchestra with borrowed instruments, rehearsing Schubert and Brahms that drifted across the desert night. There were fences, barbed wire, watchtowers, but the cruelty they expected never materialized. Instead, they found a system that treated them as human beings, a system that obeyed the Geneva Convention as if it were Holy Writ. And still, disbelief lingered. Some POWs refused to eat the desserts, convinced it was manipulation. Others hoarded bread in their lockers, unable to believe tomorrow's rations would come just as plentifully. For women who had grown up under scarcity, excess was suspicious. The abundance of American food, the meat, the butter, the sugar, was not just sustenance, it was psychological warfare of another kind. It forced them to question the world they thought they knew. It forced them to imagine that maybe the enemy wasn't the monster they had been taught to hate. The desert sun rose and set, indifferent to their confusion. Work assignments continued. Wages piled up in scrip. Letters arrived, sometimes with news too painful to bear. And always, 3 times a day, the mess hall doors opened, and another meal proved that America's prison camps were nothing like the horror they had been promised. For the German women who lived it, the shock was not cruelty. It was mercy. And mercy, they discovered, could be just as terrifying as hate. The first time Greta Hoffmann saw pie, she thought it was a trick. The slice on her tray looked unreal, a wedge of golden crust cradling soft fruit that glistened under a thin glaze. Steam curled from the filling, the air thick with the smell of cinnamon. In Germany, sweets had long since vanished into memory. Sugar was rationed, butter replaced by thin substitutes, flour stretched with sawdust. The only dessert most of them had known in years was watery jam or a crust of stale bread, and yet here, in a camp built for enemies, sat pie warm, fragrant, impossible. The women stared at it as though it might detonate. Liesel hissed her usual warning, "Don't touch it, they're mocking us." But Anna, the youngest, couldn't resist. She picked up her fork, cut into the crust, and raised a trembling bite to her lips. Her eyes widened, her whole body froze. Then, against every instinct drilled into her, she smiled. The mess hall was noisy that night. Guards joked with one another, trays clattered, the ceiling fans turned lazily in the desert heat. But at the German table, silence reigned. Each woman battled herself in private, pride against hunger, fear against longing. Pie was not just food. Pie was temptation, memory, betrayal, hope, all baked together into something too sweet to be real. When Greta finally tasted it, the fork shaking in her hand, the crust shattered between her teeth with a softness she had forgotten bread could hold. The filling was tart, not cloying, peaches maybe, or apples, she couldn't tell through the rush of sugar. She closed her eyes. For a moment she wasn't in Arizona, she wasn't a prisoner. She was back in her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of roasted nuts and spices floating in from winter markets long gone. When she opened her eyes again, tears had blurred her vision. And then came the ice cream. They first encountered it on a Sunday, lined up outside the canteen where a corporal was handing out scoops in waxy paper cups. The camp had received a delivery of frozen goods, a luxury even some American towns couldn't always count on in wartime. The German women shuffled forward, frowning, suspicious. Ice cream? In prison? They had no frame of reference. For most of them, frozen sweets were something they had read about in American magazines before the war, or heard whispered in stories about wealthy families in Berlin who owned rare machines. But here it was, melting in the desert heat, handed to them like it was nothing. Greta took her cup with both hands. The cold shocked her skin instantly, a sensation she had nearly forgotten. She hesitated, then lifted the spoon. The taste was violent in its purity, sweet cream, sugar, the faint bite of vanilla. It coated her tongue with richness so intense it felt decadent, almost indecent. She let it linger in her mouth until it dissolved into cold sweetness that made her shiver even under the sun. Around her, the other women reacted with the same stunned disbelief. Anna giggled, her lips coated white. Another prisoner gasped at the chill that stabbed her teeth. One even spat it out, muttering that it couldn't be natural, that it was witchcraft. Greta ate slowly, deliberately, because each spoonful felt like proof that her old world was gone. Pie and ice cream. To Americans, it was ordinary. To these prisoners, it was a revelation. Together, the two formed a pairing that carried weight far beyond flavor. They represented abundance, security, the possibility of joy without guilt. In German towns reduced to rubble, children dreamed of potatoes, of bread crusts, of anything at all to fill their stomachs. Yet, here in captivity, their enemies offered them desserts so rich they bordered on absurd. The women could not comprehend it. How could a nation at war afford such extravagance? How could a prison camp of all places produce luxuries their own people had not seen in years? The answer was simple, though none of them dared say it aloud. America had plenty. America was winning, and the proof melted on their tongues each Sunday. It was not just about calories. Dessert became a weapon of culture, a symbol so potent it unsettled them more than barbed wire ever could. The Germans had been taught to see Americans as crude, lazy, incapable of refinement, yet the taste of pie suggested otherwise. It spoke of a country that invested not only in strength, but in pleasure, in comfort, in the idea that happiness was a right rather than a rare indulgence. Each forkful chipped away at propaganda, each scoop forced the women to acknowledge a truth that frightened them more than enemy guns. The American way of life was not built solely on might, but on prosperity that seemed endless. At first, many resisted. Liesel refused to touch desserts, muttering that they were poisoned, that the sweetness masked humiliation. She slapped trays from younger hands, her voice sharp with betrayal. But slowly, resistance eroded. Hunger is patient, sugar persuasive. Within weeks, even the most suspicious POWs were seen eating cautiously, furtively, savoring mouthfuls when they thought no one was looking. What began as shame turned to ritual. Pie at dinner, ice cream at the canteen, cakes during holidays when the camp staff grew generous. Each occasion etched itself into memory as both comfort and torment. The cultural shock deepened with every bite. Some evenings, American guards would sit nearby, laughing over their own desserts, treating cake and coffee as casually as Germans once treated dark bread. For the prisoners, watching that ease was almost unbearable. They tasted wealth in every crumb, confidence in every spoonful. It wasn't just food, it was ideology you could eat. America's strength wasn't only in its army. It was in its ability to feed everyone, even its enemies, with sugar and cream. Letters home became impossible to write honestly. How could Greta tell her surviving relatives in Dresden that she was eating pie while they scraped ash from the ruins? How could she admit she had tasted ice cream for the first time, not in freedom, but in captivity? To write such things would feel like betrayal. So she wrote half-truths. I am safe. We are fed. I think of you always. But she never described the desserts. Those belonged to another reality, one she wasn't ready to confess even to herself. The Americans understood what they were doing. Red Cross inspectors walked the camp regularly, noting conditions, sampling meals, reporting compliance. The U.S. military wanted the world to see that it upheld the Geneva Convention with pride. But there was more beneath the surface. Every scoop of ice cream, every generous slice of cake was also a message. Look at us. Look what democracy can create. Even in war, even with enemies, we do not ration dignity. The women, whether they wanted to or not, received that message with every spoonful. The symbolism grew stronger during holidays. On Thanksgiving, the mess hall tables groaned under the weight of turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. The POWs had never heard of such a holiday, never seen a feast of such scale. Greta remembered standing with her tray, unable to comprehend the abundance before her. Guards joked, carving birds bigger than anything she had seen in Germany, while pies cooled on windowsills as if no war raged across the ocean. The Germans ate in stunned silence, unsure whether to laugh or weep. On Christmas, they were given cake frosted in white, decorated with sugar that sparkled like snow. Anna cried openly when she tasted it, saying it reminded her of childhood, of times before uniforms and air raids and hunger. For a moment, captivity didn't feel like captivity. It felt like stepping into another country's dream. But dreams carried danger. The sweetness made loyalty taste bitter. Each slice forced questions the women had no safe way to answer. Was Germany truly as strong as it claimed if it could not even feed its people while America fed its prisoners cake? Was the ideology they were raised on sturdy enough to stand against butter and sugar? And perhaps most frightening of all, if the enemy could offer kindness, what did that say about everything they had believed until now? Conversations in the barracks turned quiet, guarded. Some admitted openly that American food made them reconsider their hatred. Others, like Liesel, doubled down, insisting it was manipulation, a calculated performance. But even she could not ignore the richness of the meals. She grew heavier, her cheeks less gaunt, her eyes betraying what her words denied. Pie made liars of them all. In time, desserts became more than sustenance, they became a language. Guards would sometimes slip an extra cookie to a POW who worked hard on laundry duty. A nurse in the infirmary once brought chocolate to a woman recovering from fever, her smile soft despite the uniform. These gestures did not erase the war, but they chipped at the walls between captor and captive. Sweetness carried meaning that words could not. Where orders and propaganda failed, sugar spoke clearly. We could destroy you, but instead, we feed you. For Greta, the cultural shock transformed into curiosity. She began asking guards how pie was made, what ingredients went into ice cream, why Americans cared so much about dessert. The answers bewildered her. Pie was tradition, they said. Ice cream was summer. Cake was family. These foods weren't luxuries to them. They were symbols of home, of belonging, of the idea that life should hold joy even when the world was on fire. To a German raised on scarcity and sacrifice, the idea was revolutionary. Pleasure as a right, not a sin. Comfort is part of national identity, and so the desserts did what bombs and propaganda could not. They made the women see America differently. They planted seeds of doubt about everything they had been told. They sparked envy, admiration, guilt, hope, all tangled together in every bite. Pie and ice cream were never just pie and ice cream. They were America, distilled into sugar and cream, served in enemy hands, melting slowly into memory that could never be erased. The first time Greta dared to laugh in camp, she startled herself. It was summer, blistering heat pressing down, and one of the guards had slipped on loose gravel carrying buckets of water. He cursed in English, flailing, then tipped half the water onto his boots. Anna burst out laughing, the sound bright and sudden, and Greta couldn't stop herself from joining. For a moment, she was not a prisoner. She was just a young woman watching someone trip, but the laugh stuck in her throat almost immediately. She pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes darting to see if anyone had noticed. Liesel glared at her from across the yard, fury in her stare, but the guard only grinned sheepishly, muttering something about Arizona heat, and walked away. Greta stood frozen, heart pounding. Was she betraying her family by finding something funny here? Was she betraying Germany by feeling human in enemy hands? The guilt cut deep, but so did the memory of that brief, impossible laughter. Cultural shock came in layers. At first, it was food abundant, sweet, plentiful. Then it was treatment guards who enforced rules but didn't beat them, officers who spoke German without cruelty, the presence of law instead of vengeance. But soon, the deeper shocks began. American music drifted across the compound from radios at the guard posts, swing, jazz, voices of women singing words Greta couldn't understand but felt in her bones. Rhythms unlike anything taught in Germany, filled with improvisation, joy, chaos. At night in the barracks, some of the younger POWs hummed fragments of melodies they had picked up, trying to imitate the strange energy. Others scolded them, hissing that it was enemy noise. But the tune stuck, lingering like sugar on the tongue. One evening, the Americans screened a film for both guards and POWs. The projector hummed, reels clicking into place. On the white sheet, moving figures appeared. Hollywood stars with polished smiles, dancing, singing, driving shiny cars down endless roads. Greta sat rigid, eyes wide. She had never seen such glamour. The film wasn't propaganda in the way German newsreels were. It was lighthearted, romantic, silly even. But beneath it ran something more powerful than speeches or parades. A vision of a life filled with freedom, wealth, laughter. A life where pie was just dessert, not temptation. For the German women, it was intoxicating and terrifying. The propaganda they had been raised on had painted Americans as decadent, soulless, corrupt. Yet here was a different picture, not soullessness, but vitality, not decadence, but abundance. They had been told America was weak, fractured, incapable of discipline, yet the discipline here was quiet, rooted in rules that bound even the guards themselves. It was law that restrained cruelty, not fear of retribution. And slowly, the women realized that what had been presented to them as weakness was something else entirely, strength of a different kind. This realization did not arrive all at once. It seeped into them slowly, like water through desert sand. Greta noticed it when Anna began practicing English phrases late at night, whispering "good morning" and "thank you" into the dark. She noticed it when even Liesel, who railed against everything American, hoarded tins of peaches and syrup, her face betraying pleasure, even as her words spat hatred. The cultural shock wasn't just external. It was internal, reshaping loyalties, reshaping identities. Every taste of dessert, every laugh at a film reel, every glimpse of a world larger than the Reich created fractures in the rigid walls of ideology. For some, these fractures became wounds. Guilt gnawed at them. To survive on American generosity while families starved back home felt like treason. Greta carried this guilt like a stone in her chest. She imagined her grandmother's voice, sharp and accusing. "You eat cake while Dresden burns. You sing while your people die." The voice never stopped. But alongside it grew something unexpected: gratitude. And gratitude was dangerous. Gratitude blurred lines, made enemies into people, made prisoners into women who could still feel joy. The Americans never spoke of it openly, but they knew what they were doing. The Geneva Convention gave them the framework, but beneath it was strategy. A soldier who returned to Germany speaking of humane treatment would become a quiet ambassador for democracy. A prisoner who returned remembering pie and ice cream instead of beatings would carry home proof that the Reich had lied. In this way, desserts and films and swing music became weapons sharper than bayonets. They cracked open worldviews and let doubt seep in. And doubt could topple empires. For Greta, the breaking point came during a Red Cross inspection. The officials moved through the camp taking notes, interviewing POWs. One German woman whispered bitterly that she would tell them the truth, that this was theater, all staged. Greta watched her step forward, anger flashing in her eyes, ready to accuse the Americans of manipulation. But when the inspector asked calmly about rations, about treatment, the woman faltered. Because the truth, undeniable, was that she was fed. She was clothed. She was alive. The lies she wanted to tell dissolved against the taste of sugar still lingering on her tongue. She muttered complaints about boredom, about confinement, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Greta realized in that moment that truth was heavier than propaganda, and sometimes it came wrapped in cake frosting. The cultural shock had lasting consequences. By the time surrender came and the women were prepared for repatriation, many no longer knew what home meant. Germany was rubble. Families were gone. And the America they had glimpsed through fences and mess halls had unsettled everything they believed. Some longed to stay, even as transports carried them back across the Atlantic. Others feared the shame of telling their families that captivity had been merciful, that prison food had been better than home. Greta herself wrestled with the question endlessly. Was she traitor or survivor, collaborator or witness? She could not decide, but one truth stood clear. The cultural shock had planted something inside her that could not be erased. She had seen law restrain vengeance. She had tasted kindness in the hands of enemies. She had eaten pie and ice cream under barbed wire and realized that the world was far larger, far stranger than the Reich had ever allowed her to imagine. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. The consequences rippled outward. Some women who returned to Germany later worked with Red Cross agencies, translating, helping displaced persons. Others married American soldiers, unable to reconcile the life they glimpsed with the ruins of home. Still others clung to their bitterness, refusing to let go of anger. But all of them carried the memory of cultural shock in their bones. They had lived through a war not only of bombs but of ideas, and they had tasted the sweetness of the other side. For Greta, years later, the memory remained sharp. She remembered the first bite of pie, the cold shock of ice cream, the laughter at a clumsy guard, the music that refused to leave her ears. She remembered the guilt, the tears, the confusion. But above all, she remembered the realization that mercy was more terrifying than cruelty, because cruelty confirmed everything she had been taught. But mercy forced her to question everything she believed. History books rarely mention desert when they write of wars. They count battles, casualties, treaties. They list weapons and strategies. But for the women who lived it, sometimes the war was measured in sweetness. A spoonful of ice cream in the desert sun, a slice of pie in a mess hall, a moment when the enemy proved human, and in doing so, shattered the foundation of hatred. That was the true weapon. That was the true victory. So when you hear stories of POWs, remember this: the war was not fought only with guns. It was fought with law, with culture, with the quiet insistence that even enemies are human. And sometimes that insistence came served on a plate, warm, sweet, unforgettable. If you want more untold stories like this, the kind of history buried in silence, make sure you subscribe and join me here. Because history isn't just about battles and generals. It's about pie in prison, ice cream in the desert, and the way small mercies can change the course of entire lives.